Hello and welcome everyone. Myself Mijanur Rahaman, and today our topic of discussion is regulation of respiration, and it is the second part of this video. In the previous part, we have already discussed about the introduction, then the nervous mechanism we have started, and in the nervous mechanism we have discussed about the respiratory centers. Among these, the medullary centers, pontine centers. Now today we will try to discuss the connection of respiratory centers. Let us start. So now first of all, today our first topic is connection of respiratory centers. Now in case of connection of respiratory centers, first of all the efferent pathway. In the efferent pathway, the nerve fibers from the respiratory centers have the brainstem and descend in anterior part of the lateral column of the spinal cord. So what happened here? The nerve fibers from the respiratory centers leave the brainstem and descend in the anterior part of lateral column of the spinal cord, and these nerve fibers terminate on motor neurons in the anterior horn cells of cervical and thoracic segment of the spinal cord. So what happens here? First of all, the nerve fibers from the respiratory centers leave the brainstem. Then it descend down in the anterior part of the lateral column of the spinal cord. Then these nerve fibers terminate on motor neurons in the anterior horn cells of the cervical and thoracic segment of spinal cord. And from the motor neuron of spinal cord, two sets of fibers are arise. First one is phrenic nerve fiber, that is C3 to C5, which supply the diaphragm. Now what happens? First of all, nerve fiber from the respiratory center leave the brainstem, then it descend down in the anterior part of the lateral column of the spinal cord. Then these fibers terminate on the motor neurons in the anterior horn cells of the cervical and thoracic segment of the spinal cord. Then from the neurons of spinal cord, two sets of nerve fibers arises. First one is phrenic nerve fiber, which is C3 to C5 and which supply to the diaphragm. And number 2 is intercostal nerve fiber for T1 to T11. And this supply the external intercostal muscle. Now, the vagus nerve also contains some efferent fibers from the respiratory centers. This is the efferent pathway. Now, the afferent pathway. In case of afferent pathway, the respiratory centers receive afferent impulses from the peripheral chemoreceptors and the baroreceptors. Number 1 is peripheral chemoreceptor and the baroreceptor via the branches of glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves. Now, number 2, that is stress receptor of the lungs via vagus nerve. And by receiving the afferent impulses from these receptors, respiratory centers modulate the movements of the thoracic cage and lungs through efferent nerve fibers. So this is the connection of respiratory centers. One is efferent pathway, one is afferent pathway. In case of efferent pathway, phrenic nerve fiber, then intercostal nerve fiber. In case of afferent pathway, that is peripheral chemoreceptor and baroreceptor via the branches of glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve. And number 2, that is stress receptor of lungs via the vagus nerve. Now the integration of respiratory centers. In case of integration of respiratory centers, the role of medullary center. First of all, the role of medullary centers. In case of role, the rhythmic discharge of the inspiratory muscle, inspiratory impulses. So first of all, what we have discussed, the integration of respiratory centers. And in case of integration of respiratory centers, first of all, the role of medullary center. And in case of role, the first role is rhythmic discharge of inspiratory impulses. Now, dorsal respiratory group of neurons are responsible for the normal rhythm of respiration. So, which group of respiratory group of neurons are responsible for the normal rhythm of respiration? That is the dorsal respiratory group. In a previous video yesterday, we have already discussed. And these neurons maintain the normal rhythm of respiration by discharging the impulses or action potential rhythmically, and these impulses are transmitted to respiratory muscle by phrenic and intercostal nerves. Now, the inspiratory ramp. First point is covered, that is rhythmic discharge of inspiratory impulses. The dorsal respiratory group of neurons are responsible for the normal rhythm of respiration, and these neurons maintain the normal rhythm of respiration by discharging the impulses, which is action potential, and this action potential are released or discharged rhythmically, and these impulses are transmitted to respiratory muscles by phrenic and intercostal nerve. Now the second point, that is inspiratory ramp. Inspiratory ramp is a pattern of impulse discharge from the dorsal respiratory group of neurons. So, what is inspiratory ramp? Now, inspiratory ramp is the pattern of impulse discharge from the dorsal respiratory group of neurons. So, what is inspiratory ramp? Inspiratory ramp, that is the pattern of impulse that discharge from the dorsal respiratory group of neurons, and these impulses are characterized by steady increase in amplitude of the action potential, and impulse discharge from these neurons is not sudden, and it is also not uniform. So it is the character of this type of the impulse are that the impulse discharge from these neurons is not sudden and it is not uniform. Now, inspiratory ramp signals. To start with, the amplitude of action potential is low. It is due to the activation of only few neurons. Later, more and more neurons are activated, leading to gradual increase in the amplitude of the action potential in a ramp fashion. And impulses of this type of discharge from or dorsal group of neurons are called inspiratory ramp signals. So first of all, in case of inspiratory ramp signals, there the amplitude of action potential is very low, and it is due to the activation of only few neurons. Later, more and more neurons are activated, which leads to gradual increase in the amplitude of the action potential in a ramp fashion, and the impulses of this type discharge from the dorsal group of neurons are called inspiratory ramp signals. And ramp signals are not produced continuously but only for a period of 2 seconds. So what happens? Ramp signals is not produced continuously but only for a period of 2 seconds, and during which inspiration occurs. Now, after 2 seconds, ramp signals stop abruptly and do not appear for another 3 seconds. Switching of ramp signals causes expiration. So, first 2 seconds inspiration, next 3 seconds expiration. And at the end of 3 seconds, the inspiratory ramp signals reappear in the same pattern and the cycle is repeated. Now, in this fashion, the inspiration and expiration is repeated again and again. Now, normally during inspiration, the dorsal respiratory group neurons inhibit expiratory neurons of ventral group, and during expiration, the expiratory neurons inhibit the dorsal group of neurons. Thus, the medullary respiratory centers control each other. So, what happens? During inspiration, the dorsal respiratory group neurons inhibit the expiratory neurons of ventral group, and when the expiration occurs, the expiratory neurons inhibit the dorsal group of neurons. Thus, the medullary respiratory centers control each other. Now, what is the significance of inspiratory ramp signals? Significance of the inspiratory ramp signals is that there is a slow and steady inspiration so that the filling of lungs with air is also steady. Now, role of pontine center. Pontine's respiratory centers regulate the medullary centers, and apneistic center accelerate the activity of the dorsal group of neurons. And the stimulation of the center causes prolonged inspiration. And pneumataxic center inhibits the apneistic center and restricts the duration of inspiration. Now, Free-Bodzinger complex, first point. Free-Bodzinger complex is an additional respiratory center found in animals. It is found by the group of neurons of called pacemaker neurons. And located in the ventrolateral part of the medulla. So free complex is an additional respiratory centers which is found in animals, and it is found by a group of neurons called pacemaker neurons, and it is located in the ventrolateral part of medulla. Pacemaker neurons generate rhythmic respiratory impulses and medullary centers and nerve fibers into this complex. An exact functioning mechanism of this complex is not known. So this is our today's short topic. If we try to summarize this, in the first point we have discussed what are the connection of respiratory centers. There are two pathways. One is efferent pathway and afferent pathway. The efferent pathway, that is the nerve fibers from respiratory centers leave the brainstem and descend in the anterior part of the lateral column of the spinal cord, and these nerve fibers terminate on motor neurons in the anterior horn cells of the cervical and thoracic segment of the spinal cord, and from the motor neuron of spinal cord there are two sets of nerve fibers arise. One is phrenic nerve fibers and one is intercostal nerve fiber. The phrenic nerve fiber which supply the diaphragm and its source is C3 to C5, and the intercostal nerve fibers, that is T1 to T11, which supply the external intercostal muscle. And the vagus nerve also contains some efferent fibers from the respiratory centers. Now the afferent pathway. Respiratory centers receive afferent impulses from the peripheral chemoreceptors and baroreceptors via the branches of glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve. Now in the second point, the stress receptor also help in the afferent pathway of lungs via the vagus nerve, and by receiving the afferent impulses from these receptors, the respiratory centers modulate the movements of the thoracic cage and lungs through efferent nerve fibers. Now integration of respiratory centers. What are the roles of medullary centers? In case of role of medullary center, the first role is rhythmic discharge of inspiratory impulse. So what happened here? The dorsal group of respiratory neurons are responsible for the normal rhythm of respiration and these neurons maintain the normal rhythm of respiration by discharging the impulses or action potential rhythmically, and these impulses are transmitted to the respiratory muscles by the phrenic and intercostal nerves. Now in the second point, that is inspiratory ramp. The inspiratory ramp is the pattern of impulse that discharges from the dorsal respiratory group of neurons, and these impulses are characterized by the steady increase in the amplitude of the action potential, and the impulse discharge from these neurons is not sudden and it is not also uniform. So it is the characteristic of the inspiratory ramp impulse. So what happens? The impulse discharge from these neurons is not sudden and it is also not uniform. Now inspiratory ramp signals. To start with, the amplitude of the action potential is low and it is due to the activation of only few neurons. Later more and more of neurons are activated, which leads to gradual increase in the amplitude of the action potential in a ramp fashion in a stepwise pathway, 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like that. Then the impulses of this type of discharge from the dorsal group neurons are called inspiratory ramp signals, and these ramp signals are not produced continuously but only for a period of 2 seconds. When the ramp signals is produced for 2 seconds, during which inspiration occurs. After 2 seconds, the ramp signal stops abruptly and do not appear for another 3 seconds. So in this 3 seconds, when the ramp signal is not coming, here the expiration part of the respiration is occurring. So if you take the 5 second, first 2 seconds when the ramp signals are coming, then the inspiration is occurring, and when in the later 3 seconds when the ramp signals is not coming, then the expiration is occurring. And this is the mechanism in which the switching of the ramp signals causes expiration, and at the end of 3 seconds the inspiratory ramp signals again reappear, and in the same pattern the cycle is repeated again and again, the inspiration, expiration, inspiration, expiration, 2 second inspiration, 3 second expiration, 2 second inspiration, 3 second expiration. This is the cycle which is continuous for the lifetime. And normally during inspiration, the dorsal respiratory group of neurons inhibit the expiratory neurons of ventral group, and during expiration the expiratory neurons inhibit the dorsal group of neurons. Thus the medullary respiratory centers control each other. Now we have discussed about the significance of inspiratory ramp signals. The inspiratory ramp signals is that there is a slow and steady inspiration so that the filling of lungs with air is also steady. Now in the previous part we have discussed about the role of medullary center. Now we will know about the role of pontine center. Now pontine respiratory centers regulate the medullary centers. Apneistic center accelerate the activity of dorsal group of neuron, and stimulation of these neurons causes prolonged inspiration. And the pneumatoxis center inhibits the apneistic center and restricts the duration of inspiration. So what happens? The pontine respiratory centers regulate the medullary centers, okay, and apneistic center accelerate the activity of dorsal group of neurons, and stimulate of these centers causes prolonged inspiration, and pneumotoxic center inhibits the apneistic center, which restrict the duration of inspiration. Now, pre-Warzinger complex. Pre-Warzinger complex is an additional respiratory center which is found in animals, and it is formed by a group of neurons called pacemaker neurons, and which is located in the ventrolateral part of the medulla. And pacemaker neurons generate the rhythmic respiratory muscles impulses, and medullary centers send nerve fibers into this complex, and exact function mechanism of this complex is not known till date. So what is pre-Warzinger complex? If someone asks you that what is pre-Warzinger complex, then you can say that it is an additional type of respiratory centers which is found in case of animals, and it is formed by a group of neurons called pacemaker neuron, which is located in the ventrolateral part of the medulla. Now some additional information, like pacemaker neurons are generated with the rhythmic respiratory impulses, and medullary centers send the nerve fibers into this complex, and exact function mechanism of this complex is not known till date. So this is our today's topic. I think you have understood very well. If you have any query or any doubt, you can comment down in the comment section and ask any question if you have query about this topic. And you can also suggest me in which topic you want the next video. And thank you so much for watching the entire video. Do like, share and subscribe to my channel for supporting me and my channel. And thank you so much for watching.